Today, we will learn and reflect on the commandment, do not slander, in the Small and Large Catechisms penned by Martin Luther. In many of his teachings on the Ten Commandments in the Catechisms, Luther often brings up issues we often confront in our daily lives that are not mentioned by other commentators. So we can benefit from studying his catechism even if we're not Lutheran. When discussing the sin of slander, Luther also cautions us how lying and slander can derail legal proceedings. At the end of our talk, we'll discuss the sources we use for this video. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments. Let us learn and reflect together. Martin Luther had a legitimate concern that the Catholic Church had become too distant from the laymen that the average Catholic could not participate in the Catholic Masses that were held in Latin. Indeed, many local priests only learned enough Latin so they could deliver the Mass and didn't even know the meaning of the Latin words they were repeating. So education for both clergy and laymen were needed. Issuing a catechism helped bring the church teachings to the masses, particularly to the young Lutherans attending confirmation classes, and the Large Catechism was issued for the benefit of the heads of household and the clergy. Now, to give you an idea of the timeline, Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg in 1517, but it wasn't until 1522 that he started organizing a new church structure. The Lutheran Small and Large Catechisms were issued in 1529, and in 1530 was the Augsburg Confession, which meant that they were kind of issued somewhat simultaneously. The Catholic Catechism, issued in response to the challenges posed by Luther, was issued after the Council of Trent in 1566. And the post-Vatican II Catholic Catechism, which based much of its theological teachings on the Trent Decrees, was issued in 1985. Fortunately, one of the advantages of the Small Catechism is its clarity. So we'll start with the Small Catechism on the commandments for do not slander. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. What does this mean? Luther tells us. We should fear and love God, so we do not tell lies about our neighbor, nor betray, slander, or defame him, but we should apologize for him, speak well of him, and interpret charitably all that he does. And many of the church fathers teach us that instead of making excuses for ourselves and judging our neighbor harshly, we should instead make excuses for our neighbor and judge ourselves harshly. But who does that? And as an example of that, we have the prayer of St. Ephrem. And this Orthodox prayer goes like this. O Lord and Master of my life, grant me not a spirit of sloth, despondency, love of power, and idle talk. And we guard against idle talk, we're guarding against slander. But give to me, your servant, a spirit of sober-mindedness, humility, patience, and love. Yes, O Lord and King, and here's the kicker, grant me to see my own faults and not to judge my neighbor, since you are blessed to the ages of ages. Luther starts his Large Catechism commentary on the commandment memorably. Besides our own body, our wife or husband, and our temporal property, we have one more treasure which is indispensable to us, namely our honor and good name, for it is intolerable to live among men in public disgrace and contempt. Our reputation is our most precious possession, more important than baubles and gold. Every man wants to maintain his self-respect before his wife, children, servants, and neighbors. This commandment demands that justice should be administered equitably for all, for both rich and poor, and should be blind to all influence, looking only at the evidence presented. And Luther tells us, a judge should be a man of integrity, not only upright, but a wise, sagacious, brave, and fearless man. Likewise, a witness should be both fearless and upright. Everyone should help his neighbor maintain his rights. And this commandment also forbids all sins of the tongue by which we may injure or offend our neighbor. Luther uses his quick wit like a 2x4 to beat up on the backbiters who, learning a bit of gossip about someone else, spread it into every corner, relishing and delighting in it like pigs that roll in the mud and root around in the mud with their snouts. Positively stated, we not only should avoid telling falsehoods about our neighbor, we are exhorted to protect our neighbor's reputation, even when our neighbor makes his defense difficult. Luther also states this memorably. Nobody has the right to judge and reprove his neighbor publicly, even when he has seen a sin committed, unless he has been authorized to judge and reprove. And he continues, There is a great difference between judging sin and having knowledge of sin. Knowledge of sin does not give you a right to judge it. I may see and hear that my neighbor sins, but to make him the talk of the town is not my business. If I interfere and pass sentence on him, I fall into a greater sin than his. When you become aware of a sin, simply make your ears a tomb and bury it. God forbids you to speak evil about your neighbor, even when he is guilty. So when our neighbor has seriously wronged us, do we complain? Should we seek justice? How should we seek justice? Luther reminds us that the Gospel of Matthew gives us a protocol from settling disputes. And this is quoting from Scripture. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of the 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. We need to be cautious. We may be endangering our salvation with our complaints. Rather, our salvation comes from improving our relationships with our neighbor, not allowing our complaints to deteriorate into harmful gossip and slander, which is poisonous rather than helpful. But when confronting our nasty neighbor, why, he might get upset or confrontational or even violent, and we might even learn that we are wrong. So how do we follow this commandment in our daily lives? Just as we should not lie or slander or gossip about our neighbor, so we should not listen to those who lie or slander or gossip and ruin our neighbor's reputation. We must go further, as Luther reminds us. If you encounter somebody with a worthless tongue who gossips and slanders someone, rebuke him straight to his face and make him blush for shame. Why should we rebuke the slanderer? Why not just slink away and ignore him? You may, as Luther says, silence someone who would bring some poor man into disgrace, from which he cannot clear himself. Honor and a good name are easily taken away, but not easily restored. So what do you do at work when you have to work with someone who can be really difficult to work with, and everybody at work knows it, and everybody is tempted to complain? Now, this isn't technically gossip or slander, because everybody knows they're difficult to work with, but it could be at least a form of soft slander, because constant complaints like this over a long period of time can be very damaging to both the person's reputation, but also can ratchet up the meanness and cruelty of the office chatter. And you can try and lighten up the chatter a little bit. You can tell your coworkers that they should be grateful, for if the company puts up with nonsense from people like them, they will surely put up with you. Or you can point out that you really don't know what difficulties these people have had and have to face in their personal life. How should we protect our neighbor's reputation? Luther suggests that we should use our tongue to speak good of everyone, to cover up our neighbor's sins and infirmities, to overlook them, and to cloak and veil them with our own honor. This is how we should treat our neighbor, because that is how we wish to be treated ourselves. It is a noble virtue to always put the best construction on what we hear about our neighbor, as long as it is not a notorious evil, and to defend him against the poisonous tongues of those who are busy wherever they can pry out and pounce on something to criticize their neighbor, twisting everything around in the worst possible way. Luther makes an exception for public sins, which allows us to criticize and question the motives of political and public figures. But then he says this allows us to censure the Pope and his teaching, which is publicly set forth in books and shouted throughout the world. Now, Professor Carey, in his lectures in the Great Courses on Luther, points out that Luther's criticism of the Pope went further than other criticisms of his day. He contended that the institution of the papacy itself was corrupt, often calling the papacy things like the whore of Babylon and sometimes worse. And what good can come from this? Now, Luther helped keep a lid on the more extreme political conflicts during his lifetime, but soon after his death, all of Europe erupted in the 30 Years' War, first between Catholics and Protestants, and millions of Germans and other Europeans died in these wars. Now, such polemics were traded between Catholics and Protestants for centuries, until Vatican II unilaterally called a ceasefire, with Pope John the 23rd calling for a pastoral council with a conciliatory restatement of Catholic beliefs, avoiding the declarations of anathemas the council decrees had pronounced for millennia. In other words, if you believe thus and thus, may you be anathema. But face group books on both sides still devote themselves to trading polemics. And why is this? The enemy, the deceiver, would rather us argue among ourselves about who is damned and who is not, than discuss love and faith and hope. And these polemics and triumphalism do not increase the love of God in anyone's heart. And just as we should respect the religious liberty of everyone to worship God as they believe, so we should also respect the Church and the Church authorities, Holy Scripture, and the writings of the Church Fathers, the Pope, the bishops, and the priests and pastors of all denominations. Speaking of this from Luther's perspective, Luther was afraid for his life, and after the Diet of Worms, the emperor declared him an outlaw and a heretic, and this meant a death sentence. And this death sentence meant that Luther would rarely leave the town of Wittenberg for the rest of his life. Now, disappointingly, Luther goes off on a minor anti-Semitic rant in his explanation of this commandment, but we've discussed the problem of Luther and his anti-Semitism in another video. We don't need to repeat it here. Now we'll discuss the sources we use for our video. Our primary source for this video is the Book of Concord, the Confessional Handbook of the Lutheran Church. This includes the Large and Small Catechism, which you can purchase separately. And we would also like to mention the many videos by the Lutheran professor, who is also an Augustinian scholar, Dr. Philip Carey. His life mission was bridging the chasm between the Protestant and Catholic churches, and he has many excellent, balanced, and respectful lectures on Luther, St. Augustine's, and the history of Christianity in the Western tradition that are in the great courses, but not yet the Wondrium lecture series. Finally, in his final lectures on Luther, he ponders a question I had never heard pondered for decades. How could a leading theologian be so angry? Isn't perpetual anger spiritually dangerous? And plus, we have a video on the history of the Lutheran and Catholic catechisms, and we have this wonderful thumbnail painting of Luther at the Diet of Worms. The YouTube description links to the video script and our blog. Please support our channel by sharing this video with your friends, and by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons, and by clicking on the Amazon links to purchase any of the books we discussed, which will earn us a small affiliate commission. And please consider becoming a patron of our channel. And please click on the links for interesting videos on other topics that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.